Hello, this is Rick Jordan, Church Resources Coordinator for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. I want to welcome you to this webinar on immigration issues. Our guest presenter today is Anna Cushman. Anna is the Faith Community Liaison for the American Immigration Lawyers Association. She lives in Charlotte. Today's webinar will begin with Anna's presentation. And if you have questions or comments to make, you can enter them in the question box at any time. The question box is at the bottom of your screen. Just scroll to the bottom of the screen. It says Q&A, and you can enter things at any time. If there's a clarification question that needs to be made, I can interrupt Anna, but otherwise we'll probably hold questions until the end. Thank you for your participation in today's webinar, and just a reminder, we are recording this, and we will be putting it on the CBF North Carolina Virtual Resource Library on our website. Anna, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Rick. Glad to be here.
Before you begin your formal presentation, tell us how you became interested in this subject.
Yes, well, I've always been interested in trying to help people navigate complex systems, and particularly I personally enjoy travel and getting to know people from different cultures and from around the world. And so that really put me on my path to becoming an immigration attorney. And thankfully have been able to practice that for the past 6.5 years. And it's never a dull moment. So I'm delighted to be able to share this information with all who are interested.
And Anna, you know, law apparently is a black and white world. Is that true?
Yes. I'm coming to you from a black and white camera today, not necessarily by design, but who am I to question the good Lord and how I'm to appear to you today? Jokingly, yes, we're talking about, in some ways, the good old days. I will provide an overview of our immigration system today, but it's something that is always changing. And in some ways, just several years ago, it was a more favorable environment for immigrants in our country. And it's just something that ebbs and flows over time. So, yes,
yeah.
Taking a look back with our black and white perspective a little bit.
Okay, good. And also just couldn't find that setting, right?
That's right. Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, Anna, thank you for leading us. I look forward to your presentation. And again, guys, if you have questions, just put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them later in the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. So today, everyone, I'm going to do my best in the time that we have together to explain our U.S. immigration system and to also talk about other related topics and how you and your congregations may begin to think about how to love on and support our immigrants in the United States, which many people come to think of them as neighbors, in fact. But we will talk a little bit about the legal framework, a little bit about history, and then bring it back to present day. And so as this describes a little bit of the overview of what we're going to walk through, I think it's always important for us to remember that we're talking about the movement of people, and that is a phenomenon that has occurred throughout history. And in fact, I would just call it a continual human phenomenon as we seek opportunity. Maybe we are fleeing war or famine. There's often push factors as well as pull factors that make people move about and seeking a better life. So although there are so many things that you may hear about, read about in present day, I would just, let's all remember that it is the common thread is humans seeking their greatest potential and a better way of life. And we'll also, I'll say a quick word about historical trends in immigration in the United States, and then our current U.S. immigration system. And then I look forward to responding to your questions, because at the end of the day, I am here to resolve any doubts you may have and address the topics of that are weighing on your minds and that you and your congregation are wrestling with. And I hope to be a resource to you today and in the future. So just a quick word about historical trends in U.S. immigration. So we have this idea of Lady Liberty and being a welcoming nation. At the pedestal there of the Statue of Liberty, you'll find an incredible poem by Emma Lazarus, which talks about the huddled masses yearning to breathe free and everyone who is trying to knock at the golden door, and how our nation wishes to be a new Colossus, which is the name of the title of that poem. And Lady Liberty there is, in a sense, a new Colossus, a new statue to memorialize that new way of being. So we wish to be, in our most idyllic sense, a welcoming nation of immigrants. And if you look through our history, you will see that in more so in some periods and less so in others. You could look back at the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s, where we barred all across the board Chinese nationals, and that took, several decades to be repealed. So you'll find throughout our history where there's times of plenty, perhaps there's more of a sense of welcome, but when there is war or other factors and focused on isolation, it's very restrictionist, and certain nationalities bear the brunt of that over time. So we have the welcome, yes, but we also have the wall. So I kind of wish to show the dichotomy here, where, we have the wonderful poem by Emma Lazarus and Lady Liberty welcoming people to Ellis Island, but we also have an incredible push to restrict our immigration. And what should that look like? So I believe Americans have struggled throughout our history to figure out, well, what is exactly the right mix of being a restrictionist nation or a welcoming nation? And we're still walking through that struggle today, frankly. I have to point out that the book of Exodus is an excellent read for anyone who wants to study migration or immigration. I read it in its entirety a few years ago because I thought, well, I'm an immigration attorney. Surely I need to know about Exodus. And a few points stood out to me that I wanted to share with you, and that is, when you start reading Exodus, Pharaoh is concerned about the birth rate of the Hebrews and is fearful at his loss of power. And in our country, we have disparate birth rates between immigrant groups and native populations, and many people are seeing that trend, and for some that causes great fear. Moses' mother had to give Moses up, as we all know, send him down the river. That imagery makes me think of many mothers in what we call the Northern Triangle in Central America, where there is gang violence and many other forces that cause parents to say, this is not a safe place for my child. And even if it's as dangerous as sending you north to the unknown, it's better than you staying here. And so that was a modern parallel that I saw to my eyes. And then when we have Moses, who is Hebrew but raised Egyptian, it made me think of our dreamers. When I say dreamers, I'm referring to young people who were brought to the United States by their parents without permission years ago, and have essentially grown up in the United States, are Americanized, graduating from our high schools. An incredible story there. But I see them having this incredible power, and that they know the immigrant experience to some extent, but yet they can talk the talk, so to speak. They can interact and really speak truth to power in the United States because of that mix that they have experienced in their life. And then, of course, God selects Moses to speak truth to power, so to speak, with Pharaoh, but he is concerned about his ability to speak, and but God provides Aaron. And when I was thinking, oh my goodness, there's concern about language barriers here. Moses is concerned about his ability to speak. And one thing that many people think of with immigrants is a language barrier or challenges in speaking English and truly assimilating, even though they may be incredibly intelligent. People often view them as lesser than because their English isn't perfect. Well, God provides. God provided Aaron. And in many ways, my prayer is that my fellow attorneys and advocates, that we can try to be Aaron for the immigrant population who is trying to speak truth to power, so to speak, about their experience and how this nation should improve its laws and to treat immigrants better. So I think it's also important to understand what is a refugee. So here you'll find the definition. I won't read it to you, but one key thing to understand is that refugees are abroad, and the process to arrive to the United States is from asylum seekers. So although asylum seekers and refugees face the same tribulations, and it has to be one of those listed here in the definition, refugees go through a process conducted by the UNHCR. That's the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And that is a fairly long and arduous process. And I have a slide on that. Again, my point here is look at all the steps and the time that it takes. So I just want everyone to understand that we have a pretty thorough vetting process, and relatively small numbers go through this process when you think about the numbers of displaced people around the world. So here's the second part of that diagram that shows you the different steps that refugees must go through. So asylum, similar definition. In fact, pretty much the same definition in the sense that you're suffered persecution, or you will suffer persecution based on these categories. The membership, and also a quick word about membership in particular social group. This is a basis for asylum that it sounds so broad, but in fact, lots of case law and in fact, decisions by our Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, to really narrow that down have made it quite narrow. For example, Guatemalan women fleeing domestic violence at the hands of their husband. That might be a particular social group. Or Guatemalan women who refuse to be property of their spouse. That could be a particular social group. So it's something that we attorneys and with the clients there struggle to try to carve out what is this social group. It need not be so large as that the government will see, oh no, there's the floodgates are opening up. We can't have that, but actually be quite tailored to that individual person's experience, but truly be a social group, and that there's an identifiable group of people who you could say, oh yes, she's in that group, she's in that group. So that area is kind of a hot piece of our law that is ever changing, and many of my colleagues who focus exclusively on asylum are quite busy. So let's bring it down to a more local level. In North Carolina, we have many reasons to pay attention to the impact of immigrants. And here are just a diagram of many of the positive benefits of immigrants. And I think they are some of the most industrious and entrepreneurial folks I've met. I've had the pleasure to work with many people who were starting businesses and investing in those businesses. and needed a visa in order to see that through. So it's an incredible, they bring an incredible boost to our economy as well as just the cultural fabric of our state. Okay, so getting to our system. I basically divide it into 3 parts, and it's always good to try to start big and then we'll drill down, right? So there's 3 parts. The family-based immigration. So an example of that, U.S. citizen goes abroad, meets the love of his life. They want to get married. Let's just say in this example, she's from Italy or India. And he is going to petition for her to immigrate to the United States as his spouse. So that would be a marriage-based green card case. So that's probably one that most people know about. And that's just one example of family-based immigration, because a U.S. citizen could also petition for brothers, sisters, parents. I'll show you the list here in a moment. Employment-based immigration, an example I give is you have Coca-Cola, multinational company. Let's say they have an engineer in Mexico City and they want that engineer to come work in their factory in Atlanta and assist on a project. Well, Coca-Cola can petition for that engineer to come to the United States and obtain a green card and work for them indefinitely in the United States. And then the third prong, I call it the humanitarian benefits. So these immigrants are going to obtain lawful permanent residence not because there was a petition filed for them by a family member or a U.S. employer, but rather the law provides for certain criteria and they meet that criteria, such as the U visa, which is the crime victim visa. Someone who's been a victim of a serious crime, has suffered severe emotional or physical harm, was cooperative in that investigation with law enforcement. So if you meet those requirements, then that is in this third category, humanitarian benefits. And then you have some other examples there also. So just an overview of the family-based system. I'll explain what these letters are next to each category. So IR is immediate relative. That is the highest place in our hierarchy. So spouses, minor children of U.S. citizens get the best treatment, essentially, in our system, where every year under the law, there's a certain number of immigrant visas available. And I think of it in like a block, right? And all these other petitions, the F2A, the F1, F3, F4, they are all fighting. This is my fingers showing a fight. They're all fighting for a visa in this block. And there's always more visa petitions filed than there are visas available. So you get backlog. Or some people would think of this as the line, right? So whenever we're evaluating a case, we're always trying to see, well, is there any way this could be an immediate relative case versus an F4 option? Because frankly, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens are often waiting, 12 years. It could be, or longer, depends on the nationality. And here I'll give you an example. So you saw those letters, right? So F4, I always use that, this is an example. It's an extreme example, but it's important for you to understand just how long some people are waiting in our family-based immigration system. So over here, this is the visa bulletin. And so let's look over, let's say I have a Mexican brother, F4, you look to the bottom and then move over to the column Mexico. That says that if I filed that petition for my brother on February 8th, 1998, in April of 2019, it is now time to continue the process. So you do the math. That is a long time for that brother to be waiting abroad for his time to come in. Even for, let's say, minor children of lawful permanent residents, green card holders, so F2A, that's still March of 2017. You know, that's 2 years. So you're gonna have to wait 2 years to bring your child when you're a lawful permanent resident. So these waits can be very taxing on families, to say the least. Okay, I know this looks a little like Greek, but, and some of you aren't fazed by Greek, right? You studied it in seminary. But anyway, this with all the C's means current, meaning there is no backlog, which is great. However, there's still backlog in some other important categories. So when I see the F2, the second category, and then we look at India, that's April of 2009. So that's the second F2, EB2, because we're in employment-based category. That is your advanced degree. So the engineer who has the master's in computer science, that is 10 years ago. So we're talking about an employer who is waiting 10 years for their employee to get a green card based on their petition. So that's a long time for an employer to be able to wait. And so what they do is they file for a non-immigrant visa, and the worker has that kind of visa for years while they're waiting for this to process. So speaking of those non-immigrant visas, the most common is the people here know about is the H-1B. It's the specialty occupation one. There's 65,000 of them available each year, and it's for jobs that require a bachelor's degree or higher. There's incredible demand, and so each year there are more applications filed than there are visas available. So what happens is there's a lottery. So our economy is waiting on a lottery, essentially. U.S. employers, they don't like it at all. They need this talent, but this is what they must go through. So there are lots of folks who are pushing for an increase in the cap. E1, E2, I love that visa category because I had the pleasure of working with some immigrant entrepreneurs who wanted to start businesses in the United States, and was able to kind of help them on their business plan and prove to the U.S. government that they are investing in this company. They're going to start it up. They're going to hire Americans. They're going to bring their expertise here. So I won't go through all of these, but employers have to weigh the cost and the processing time of any of these options, as well as how many years do you get? What's kind of your bang for your buck, essentially. And for example, with H-1B, the maximum is 6 years. So we always look at the kind of job and see which of these options may be available. Okay, humanitarian-based benefits. So I've already mentioned the U visa, the crime victim visa. The T visa, human trafficking victim visa, is really helpful. Then we've got the Violence Against Women Act. That's what VAWA stands for. And essentially, Congress recognizes that U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents may use their status against their spouse and use it as a tool of abuse, unfortunately. So thankfully, those immigrant spouses who are abused need not stay in those relationships. They can self-petition, file for themselves, and prove the nature of abuse and prove that they're married to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, and they themselves can obtain a green card. So that is a fantastic program, in my opinion. We've already talked about asylum. Must mention deferred action for childhood arrival. That was created by President Obama in 2012. President Trump has attempted to cancel it in a memo in September of 17, I believe it was, but there's been lots of litigation related to that on how the president can take that benefit away. And so those who have DACA are allowed to renew it, but there are no new cases being accepted right now. Temporary protected status. This is something that when there was the earthquake in Haiti, when you've seen this natural disasters all over, Nepal, Honduras 20 years ago, so many different disasters like that, but also civil war. So Syria, gosh, there's plenty of other armed conflicts that have forced people to leave, and it's not safe for the United States to return them to their country of origin. It just would be wrong and against our values to try to throw somebody back into that situation. So the United States grants those nationals temporary protected status, something they apply for and can renew. And the Department of Homeland Security decides whether this gets re-designated or extended further. And so, although it's called temporary protected status, the T, you think temporary, what does that mean? Well, it's come to mean anything we've decided it should mean. So the Trump administration recently has tried to cut off temporary protected status. So they're kind of there with the dreamers in kind of a precarious situation. But it's just important that we understand the nature of benefits when they're given, is that often they are subject to rescission when they are based on executive power, I should say, rather than created by Congress. So I thought it was important that everyone have an understanding of the U visa, because as you go out into the community, and it's very possible that you will come across someone who has been a victim of a crime and is fearful about speaking to law enforcement and reporting that crime. Maybe they feel very alone and isolated. And I think it's important for them to understand that there is a visa that exists to encourage victims of crime to cooperate with law enforcement, whether that be the police, the district attorney, it could be Department of Social Services, who's investigating the welfare of the children in the home and incidentally investigates domestic violence. It could be the Department of Labor as they see wage and hour violations and then sort of begin to understand that there's a bigger scheme here where false promises were made to workers and they're not being treated well. So this has been a fantastic program, such that when it was created in 2000, there was 10,000 visas available. But now, each year, I believe since about 2008, those 10,000 are used up each year. And so now we have an incredible waiting list for people to get one of those U visas. Because after 3 years with the U visa, you are able to apply for the green card. So it's actually a non-immigrant visa that's a journey to the goal, which is lawful permanent residence, which provides an incredible amount of stability because you have the right to work indefinitely and you have the right to live here indefinitely. We're going to take a quick moment and look at what is human trafficking. It has so many different aspects to it. And I don't want people to just think about commercial sex trafficking. I'd like for people to have kind of a broader understanding of that. So that's why I wanted to touch this a moment. Because, for example, when you look down here, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, that could be in a factory here in North Carolina, that could be out in the fields here in North Carolina, that could be drug traffickers forcing people to carry backpacks through the desert full of drugs, and the person, of course, didn't know that they were in with that kind of smuggler. You know, they thought somebody was just bringing them to the States, but in fact, they are out in the desert. They're in a very precarious situation, and they're now being forced to labor to carry, let's say, a backpack through the desert. So lots of different possible methods of human trafficking. And I think when we meet someone and get to know them and perhaps learn about their journey to the United States, that's when my ears perk up and I'm trying to listen for anything where there was force or fraud or coercion, or they were forced to do something that was not, part of the deal, so to speak. And that may be the basis for a T visa. So here's just an overview of kind of breaking that definition down, because it definitely is a mouthful, but it's kind of any combination of these things and you meet the definition. So it's a big problem in the United States, and it's something that I think we continually need to be on alert for. I myself spent a summer before law school at the Protection Project in Washington, D.C., which basically tries to research how is the human trafficking situation in countries around the world, and have they made it illegal even on their books. And so there's so many ways to kind of come at this problem. And I think given all of our highways and byways in North Carolina, we're particularly vulnerable to this kind of humanitarian crisis right down the street. We're gonna carry on. So here's some examples of it, just in case anyone doubted. That someone, Sanchez et al., was prosecuted for this crime. And then the labor side, which I think is important to remember. Yep, 15 years in prison. So just keep an eye out, if you would. And just to underscore some of the common fields or industries, we don't want to stereotype necessarily, because it could be in lots of different situations, but this is what we see mainly. So day labor, carnival work, construction work, maybe somebody's out there, but they're not getting paid, they're being forced, or they were, promised something and they're not getting it. So, and so just ways to help somebody is to, when you sense that isolation and you sense that control, try to let them know that there are so many services out there for them. And we can get into that another day. Yeah. Fear, depression, it's just unfortunately very much a part of the control used by the trafficker. But thankfully, we do have some laws on the books that are quite helpful to victims. I mentioned a moment about this earlier. And so it's that threat of deportation that strikes so much fear into immigrants. And Congress recognizes that it's a tool of abuse. So I think we ourselves need to be careful in how we talk. And I say we, I'm thinking just in our political rhetoric, how we engage one another, just to recognize that we're talking about exile here, essentially, where you're uprooted from the place where you feel connected and maybe have family and community. And so we recognize how terrible this kind of threat and control is. So thankfully, there is a way out through a Violence Against Women Act petition. So when I think about barriers to access, these are the different ones that I came up with. It may be that in their culture, you would never go to the police to ask for help. You would, they would just not help you or demand money, or they're corrupt themselves, or they're in with the gang, perhaps. So I am just delighted that in many ways we have quite a professional police force in the United States that is there for immigrant crime victims. And I've witnessed that kind of professionalism in my career in working with law enforcement agencies in asking them for U visa certifications, because law enforcement has to sign off and confirm that this person was a victim, this person was cooperative, or else there is no U visa case. So I've had to kind of knock on the door of various law enforcement agencies around the state, and many of them are incredibly professional and open to helping, because I think many recognize that it takes a lot of courage to report their victimization. Language barriers, I think we can do our best to learn another language, support those who do speak it, and just try to be patient, I think, is one thing that gets forgotten. Because I think with patience and care, you can really work through lots of different communication barriers. Let's see, religious and cultural barriers, sure. Some is perhaps trying to hold on to their culture from home, and also trying to share with them that we're not trying to take that away, but maybe there's some things I need to know about life in the United States just to stay safe. Power and control factors, that's something I delve into a lot with domestic violence victims that I work with. There's an incredible diagram out there called the power and control wheel that I find is really illustrative of how there's so many tools of abuse, and I think immigrants are particularly prone to those. Transportation is always an issue, because let's remember that in North Carolina, you must have a social security number in order to obtain a driver's license. And so if you are undocumented, you do not have a social security number, you must have, let me back up, you must have work authorization in order to get a social security number nowadays. In the old days, it was different. But nowadays, you need work authorization to get that social, so then you can go to the DMV and get your driver's license showing proof of your status and proof of your social security number. So given that there are many people in North Carolina driving without a license or not driving because they don't have a license, it really can impede their ability to get access to help, whether it's legal services or other kinds of support. So I think it's important to always be sensitive to that. I know I really try to do everything I can with my clients to avoid them needing to come see me or drive to me. Or if we need that, I always ask them, well, do you have a friend who can drive you? Because we really want to remember that, well, A, that's breaking the law, driving without a license, but B, there's a lot of fear about ICE raids and ICE checkpoints, and we don't want to put anyone in a more risky situation than otherwise. And of course, the U.S. system is very complex, and it's changing all the time, so we can't expect everyone to know the inner workings of it, but it certainly makes room for all of us to step in and be a friend, be an advocate, because it's just a little bit of information can be very critical. Maybe somebody gets that green card and they need to renew that card when it's going to expire. Like there's things that people need to stay on top of, but when it's such a dynamic and complex system, people get quite overwhelmed. So we just need to patient with it in a way and keep our heads and be the best friends and advocates we can. So when someone's facing deportation, I wanted to make sure that you're aware of some important terms. Notice to appear. That is a document that is issued by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which is a sub-agency of the Department of Homeland Security. And they are tasked with the removal of immigrants who have violated their status or are here without permission. They're basically tasked with enforcing U.S. immigration laws. So when they issue a notice to appear, that has to have the date, time, and place of the immigration hearing, where the immigrant will go before an immigration judge and fight their case, basically try to prove how they are eligible for relief, and AKA the right to remain in the United States. And so that, if anyone ever has one of those, you want to pay close attention. When is that hearing? Because if you miss that hearing, then you're going to get what we call a removal order in absentia, meaning you weren't there, so we ordered you removed. And those are really hard to attack. And so then, you're fodder for ICE to actually remove you because there's an order. So I just want everyone to understand that, because if anyone's like, oh yeah, I got this notice and I don't really know what to do. Well, just read it carefully. They need to get in touch with Immigration Counsel and prepare for that upcoming hearing. The alien number, that is a number that is assigned to immigrants. It's essentially a file number, but it's a very important number, and people should, in many ways, keep it private like they would a social security number. But with that number, for example, let's say someone gets detained, picked up by ICE at an ICE raid, and let's just say Jose, and Jose's wife has his alien number. Well, she can then call this hotline and confirm what is his court date. And with his alien number, she can see where is he as they move him about within the detention system. Are they taking him down to Lumpkin, Georgia, somewhere else? So it's a very helpful number, and I think people should keep track of it. I think it's important for immigrants and everyone to remember that this is a complex system. It's best to find a competent and experienced immigration attorney to assist that individual with their upcoming hearing, because as you saw, our immigration system, as I described it, in 3 parts. Well, many immigration attorneys focus on 1 part or 2, or not the whole thing. But those who go into immigration court really need to be steeped in all of it, because this is the most high stakes kind of situation, and they need to bring all of their expertise to that case and to try to find a solution for that person who is facing removal. I put that caution out there because there are a lot of notarios that are, when I say notario, that's the Spanish word for notary, but in Latin America, if you are a notario, you are essentially have the training of a lawyer. And as we know in the United States, the notary here is just a functionary, confirming that you are who you say you are when you sign an important document. So that confusion has led lots of people to rely on notarios to file applications for immigration benefits and really screw up their life. And it's fraud. It's practicing law without a license. So it's kind of something I would caution against. And really try to steer people towards experienced immigration attorney. And it's on the North Carolina State Bar website. You can see who is a board certified immigration specialist. And there are many of them in North Carolina. And those folks have been practicing at least 5 years in immigration and have passed an exam and have lots of references from their colleagues confirming that this person is an experienced and competent immigration practitioner. So that would be one resource you can turn to. They're going to need financial and emotional support. Unfortunately, it's pretty expensive to fight your case in immigration court. It can take a long time, and it just really can be a drain on the family. So they're going to need definitely a circle of caring people. Transportation, as we mentioned before, always wonderful to have and be able to provide. And then perhaps visiting detainees while in detention. I'm aware of a nonprofit in Greensboro that does regular trips to Lumpkin, Georgia, so that people can actually visit with detainees. So I think there's a lot of room for being God's love and light for these people who are facing a very difficult situation. So ICE raid rapid response teams, that's another way to kind of get organized at a local level. And because there's going to be a lot of people who need care and support after ICE has perhaps come in and raided a factory and detained a lot of people. There's just fear, and people are going to need information about how to find their loved ones, some of which we've just discussed. And sort of steps and who's picking up my kid from school now that I got to take more hours because my husband's detained. I mean, there's just such an aftermath. So I think you can look into a rapid response team at a local level. You could conduct Bible studies on hospitality towards the stranger, perhaps start with Exodus. But there's so many opportunities there to learn what God has to say. As we discussed, transportation, I just really see it as a huge barrier. So it'd be a great godsend for people to have that kind of volunteer assist them. There's certainly the push for driver's licenses in North Carolina for undocumented neighbors. Above all, we need to pray for those who are feeling displaced here and abroad. You could go to the border. And of course, just help set the tone of being a welcoming nation who understands that there is this complex system, but when we get down to the essence, it's about people, and we need to be brothers and sisters to one another. And of course, share positive stories as you come across them, because there are immigrants doing incredible work in our communities, and I think that needs to get more attention and just so we can ensure there's a positive narrative, as there should be, about immigrants in our country. And here's just some other things you can jump into. We've got a 2020, there's an election coming. There's still time to naturalize and vote. I think that is going to be, my hope is that there's an incredible amount of naturalization clinics over the next year. Go to the ballot box and assert their after they've become a U.S. citizen. And you haven't heard of the Faith Action ID drive. So Faith Action is a nonprofit in Greensboro, and they have created an ID that is accepted by Greensboro Police Department and many other law enforcement agencies around the state that will suffice as identification, such that when the police officer, let's say, stops the person for no operator's license, they don't need to arrest them and take them to the jail just to identify them. They can just write the ticket and use that ID to say, oh, yes, this is Anna Cushman. Here's your ticket. Don't do this again. You can be on your way, which is a real savings for the Greensboro Police Department in terms of resources for such a minor traffic violation. And also for the immigrant, they don't have the trauma of being arrested and going to jail just to be identified. And just many people don't have identification. They're not eligible for any immigration benefit. They maybe are able to get to the consulate of their country in the United States to get a passport. For many countries, they need to go to Washington, D.C. And remember, I was just talking about the challenges of transportation. In Raleigh, we have the consulate for Mexico, which is very helpful, and in Guatemala. But still, there's so many nationalities that it's a real challenge to actually obtain that passport to serve as identification. So this Faith Action ID is a really neat program, and I encourage you to look into it and see if you can host one of those at your congregation. And so when I talked about the Guatemalan consulate and the Mexican consulate, I know they are always looking for events to come out to. And they'll come and table and bring lots of materials and help educate people about what does the consulate do. And there's just a lot of possibility there. The sanctuary movement, of course. I'm going to say a word about that, but there's a whole spectrum here, as you can see, of ways in which you can make a difference in the life of one of our neighbors. And I would put on one end of that spectrum is the sanctuary movement, that is literally providing housing and food and everything to an immigrant who is facing deportation within the walls of the church. And churches, schools, courthouses, hospitals are all a part of this sensitive location policy that ICE has, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so that is why churches are generally seen as off limits for ICE action. But that's maybe not always going to be the case. As I said, there's always changes, but there's certainly some constitutional issues involved also with ICE trying to essentially enter the property for the purpose of a civil matter when the congregation is exercising their right to free exercise of religion, rather. So there's a lot of issues with that. I feel like we could do a whole webinar on sanctuary, but I do think it has been a great tool, and each congregation really just needs to think about and pray about which kind of tools and action items are best for them to serve those around them. Because it's important to, and I said think about, pray about, well, it is important to know that in our U.S. code, it is illegal, it is a crime to do the following. This is one piece of it that I cut and paste: and encourages or induces an alien to come to, enter, or reside in the United States in reckless disregard of the fact that such coming to entry or residence is or will be in violation of law. So yeah, it's a federal crime to do this. So it's a really sensitive area of how would this play out in court if the U.S. government was to try to come after a church on this basis, and the church is citing the free exercise clause of the First Amendment in opposition. So I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I think this is an area that deserves more further research and investigation. So I will get with Rick about how we can provide a list of resources if you would like to read up further, because many of the things I mentioned, I can pull the links for and point you in that direction, because there's so much out there, frankly. But I think the one resource I'm going to mention just one more time is the North Carolina State Bar website, because that's where you can find other competent immigration counsel as you come across somebody. And of course, AILA, American Immigration Lawyers Association, you can also search there for immigration lawyers who are always working in this arena, and would be a great place to refer someone in need. Thank you so much. Let's see if we've got some questions.
Thank you, Anna. As a matter of fact, we don't actually have any questions, and we're approaching the end of an hour, so that works out fine.
Okay.
I do want to thank you very much for sharing this. I mean, it is kind of overwhelming, and like you say, then it changes, and yet you gave some very practical things that individuals and churches could do with our neighbors. I love the introduction with the Exodus story and the parallels that are there with Moses' life. And you just think, well, how many people are potential great leaders for our country and for our churches that are kind of the Moses of the day, and if you knew you were helping Moses, wouldn't you want to help him?
Right. Right. Exactly. That's a great way to think about it. And I was really taken aback reading Exodus with those new eyes. And I think in some ways we're seeing that struggle continue to play out, people seeking more opportunity and more freedoms. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for being with us today and for presenting such great information.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.